They say you don't find things like that unless something wants to be found. I used to think that was just the kind of poetic nonsense you hear from guys who spend too long out in the woods, breathing too much cold air and telling ghost stories over cans of warm beer. But I've seen it now. I've seen what was never meant to be above the surface. My name is Clay Radley. I'm a state-employed surveyor, and 3 months ago I was part of a 4-man team assigned to inspect drainage anomalies along the eastern range of the Bitterroot Mountains, up in Idaho. The job was supposed to be standard. Routine checks, bore samples, elevation maps. You know, the kind of government work that gets buried in a report no one reads. But what we found wasn't on any map. It wasn't even supposed to exist in this state, let alone that far inland. And now I know what it feels like when a machine breathes at you through the earth. It started with the hiss. That was the first thing I noticed, and I was the only one who heard it at first. We'd set up our mobile base near a glacial runoff lake. Calm, ringed with pines so dense the sun barely kissed the shoreline by mid-afternoon. The wind in that area is strange. It doesn't move the trees so much as it seems to circle between them, almost echoing itself. On the second night, after we'd wrapped our drone scans and the others had turned in, I stepped outside the cabin to relieve myself, and I heard it, a hiss, soft, long, like a jet of air from something ancient and buried. It wasn't the wind. It had rhythm, a pause between bursts, like breath. I remember standing there, staring at the water, and for a second I thought I saw ripples, not spreading outward like from a dropped stone, but concentric, inward, collapsing into themselves like the lake was exhaling. I told myself it was wind, but I didn't go back to sleep that night. The next morning, while checking sediment levels near the edge of the lake, Connor, the youngest on our team, flagged something odd beneath the sonar sweep from our portable reader. At first it looked like a rock shelf, but the depth was off, and the shape was too geometric. Curved metal, rounded arching segments, a surface too smooth to be natural. We adjusted the scan angle, and I remember my heart dropping in slow motion. That wasn't a rock, that was a hull, but it couldn't be. Not there. Not 480 miles from the nearest ocean. There was argument, of course. Martin, the team lead, said it was a geological anomaly, a trick of sonar. Ben, the tech specialist, started theorizing some World War II crash site cover-up. He always had a flair for drama, but the more we looked, the less we could deny it. The structure was long, narrow, and unmistakably artificial. A cylinder with a tapering bow and rear propulsor assemblies buried in the silt. A submarine, half submerged in a lake that had no recorded naval history, no access routes, no military installation anywhere within 100 miles. Martin made the call. We'd dive it. We had the suits, the lights, the drone equipment. It was either that or walk away and report an unverified contact. But curiosity doesn't let go that easy. Not when the unknown is staring back from just a few meters under the surface. On the third day, Connor went under. The water was icy. Glacial melt rarely warms, even in midsummer. We monitored his descent via tether and thermal cam, but as he reached what should have been hull depth, the feed glitched. Just static, for 3 full seconds. Then, the image returned, and there it was. Blackened metal, dull, covered in growth and time, but intact. Unmistakably intact. Connor's breathing picked up. He circled the side, brushing off a layer of sediment, and exposed a serial number. U.S. Navy Registry, SSN 731. But that couldn't be. The Thresher class was retired, and this registry belonged to a ship that was never reported missing. In fact, it had never been commissioned. Records later showed that the number had been skipped, reassigned, like it was erased before it even existed. We pulled Connor back, but something was wrong. His voice was calm. Too calm, flat. When we asked what he saw, he just said, "It wasn't sleeping." We tried to shake it off, told ourselves it was just nitrogen narcosis, cold stress, deep pressure illusions. But that night, I heard the hiss again. Closer this time. Not from the lake, from under the ground near our cabin. The next morning, the ground was damp under the gear crates. But it hadn't rained. The soil was steaming slightly, and there was a thin trail of moisture leading away from the lake toward the tree line, like something had crawled out, unseen, and slithered through the pine needles in silence. I followed it about 200 feet before it vanished under a collapsed root. I didn't say anything. Not yet. By the 5th day, we all agreed to open the hatch. There was one, partially exposed above the silt line. The wheel was fused, corroded, but Ben worked it loose with a portable torch. When the hatch creaked open, we expected water, pressure, flood. But there was none. Just cold, stale air that rolled out like breath from something that had been holding it too long. And then came the smell. Not rot, not mold, but something sterile, antiseptic, and faintly electrical. Like old servers running in a sealed room. Connor went still. Martin looked pale. Ben just muttered, "This place isn't abandoned. It's sealed." That night, none of us spoke. We sat by the fire, each lost in our own silence, the lake behind us like a black mirror that reflected nothing. Around 2 a.m., the intercom on our storage trailer sparked to life. Crackled. No power. No batteries connected. And then a voice. Just one word. Stay. It wasn't any of ours. That was the moment I realized we were already inside something. Even out there in the woods, even with the stars above and soil underfoot, we were already inside it. Not the submarine. Something older. Something that had called to us through metal lungs buried in forgotten water. And now we had opened the door. I don't think it wants us dead. Not yet. But I do think it's awake now. And watching. The first rule in site surveying is that nothing surprises you. Not landslides, not sinkholes, not even the occasional unexploded ordnance from training exercises long forgotten by the people who ordered them. But the second rule is more important. And it's one they don't print in the manuals. When something is in a place it shouldn't be, and it looks like it's been waiting for someone to notice, you step back. You take a breath. And then you start asking the kind of questions that can make your whole career vanish. We didn't step back. We stepped forward. By the time we understood what we were looking at, the trees were already bending differently. The team that had gathered was a patchwork of skills and half-clearances, brought together under the kind of vague jurisdiction that makes you sign NDAs before you're even told what state you'll be working in. There was me, Mark J. Everly, civil engineer with a background in hydrodynamics and a habit of asking questions I shouldn't. There was Dr. Lynn Okafor, a physicist on leave from a DARPA-adjacent institution whose name I still can't pronounce. A pair of U.S. Forest Service field operatives, Pollard and Reyes, whose expressions never softened past "ready to shoot." And 2 technicians from an unnamed agency who didn't speak unless you asked them something 3 times. We were told only that a structural anomaly had been identified beneath a freshwater lake bed, and that recent seismic readings suggested non-terrestrial harmonics, whatever that meant. From above, the object barely poked through the surface, just enough metal visible between ice and root systems to suggest the curve of a hull. Reyes thought it was a weather balloon at first. Pollard thought it was a drug-running plane that had crashed and been buried decades ago. But the metal was too smooth, too complete. It reflected the sky in a way that didn't ripple with the water. And when I touched it, it didn't feel cold. It felt still, like it was waiting. When we cleared more of the earth, the full curve revealed itself. Matte black, nearly 20 meters of hull uninterrupted by barnacle, rust, or visible damage. The metal didn't match any composite I'd studied. Even under direct UV light, it refused to heat or cool. Lynn ran a spectrograph. "Not steel," she said softly. "Not anything. At least, not from here." What unsettled us most was its placement. The hull wasn't embedded like something that had crashed or sunken. It was resting, positioned. The sediment under it showed no signs of trauma, no broken layers. It was as if the ground had formed around it gently, or something had placed it with surgical precision. I ran comparison checks on submarines from both the Soviet and NATO naval registries going back to 1962. Some of the design language matched late Cold War ballistic models, the Typhoon class in particular. But there were inconsistencies. No visible propeller assembly, no sonar dome. The keyline curved in an impossible pattern, too narrow at one end and too wide at the other. Optical illusions played tricks at certain angles. The shadows beneath it shifted slightly when viewed from a distance, as if the structure wasn't fully subject to our geometry. One of the techs, the taller one with the neck tattoo that looked like an old geospatial grid, finally crawled up the exposed side and scanned for serial numbers. Nothing. No identifiers. Not even scratch marks. He knocked on it with a magnetic hammer. No echo. Just a dead, full-bodied thump like the whole thing was a monolith. When Reyes took a wrench to a seam, the wrench head snapped clean off. Not rusted. not brittle. The metal simply didn't accept impact. Lynn ran her handheld EM probe along the outer skin and frowned. "There's no magnetic field," she whispered. "Nothing, like it's shielding itself from observation." At this point, we had three choices: mark it and call for deeper backup, extract what data we could and leave quietly, or open the damned thing. The vote was almost unanimous. I say almost because I hesitated. Not because of fear, but because of the patterns in the pine needles around the structure. They had shifted, curved toward the hull as if pulled by something low and gravitational, but not strong enough to feel. Pollard noticed it too. "Like they're bowing," he said. "Like this thing's been here longer than the trees." By the time we cleared the northern quadrant, we found what looked like a seam or entry port. Not a traditional hatch, but a recessed outline shaped like a gill slit, as if it had once opened organically. There were no bolts, no visible mechanism, just the faintest shimmer when sunlight hit it right. When I placed my palm near it, my fingers vibrated. Not from cold or electricity, from something deeper. It was as if the structure resonated with my own bones. We argued about how to proceed. Reyes wanted to bring in explosives. A last resort, she admitted. Lynn begged for more scans. But the shorter technician, the one with the pale eyes and the habit of muttering prime numbers under his breath, simply said, "It already knows we're here." Then he reached into his pack and pulled out a tool I'd never seen. A small rectangular device shaped like a tuning fork crossed with a compass. He held it to the seam. The air shifted. A click. Not from the hull, but from inside our own chests. Like a lock being undone in the rib cage. And the outline opened. No noise. Just motion. Seamless and smooth. Like a muscle flexing. The interior was dark. Not black, but layered in absence, as if light slowed when it entered. Reyes raised her rifle. Lynn gasped. I just stood there, breathing in the scent that rolled out. Not decay, not oil, not even metal. It was neutral. A sterile void, like the smell of a room before anything is born in it. "This wasn't buried," I murmured. "It was planted." We hadn't crossed the threshold yet. That would come next. But even standing there, on the edge of that impossible entryway, I felt the pressure behind it. Not air pressure. Intention. This wasn't an artifact. It wasn't a remnant of a war. It was a message. And we had just opened the envelope. Crossing that threshold felt like stepping into the wrong side of a mirror. The light bent oddly around the doorway. And even though we were still surrounded by pine trees and mountain air, the space just beyond the opening rejected all context. As I entered first, with Reyes behind me and Lynn cautiously recording data from the lip of the hatch, my boots made no sound on the floor inside. It wasn't silence in the traditional sense. It was suppression, like sound had been told not to exist in there. The chamber we stepped into resembled the entry vestibules of Cold War submarines I'd seen in schematics. Narrow, metallic, and efficient. But everything about it felt wrong in proportions. My eyes said the ceiling was 2 meters above me, but my body disagreed. Spatial awareness distorted slightly, as if I had to lean forward to remain upright even though the floor was level. We ran thermal checks almost immediately, expecting cold steel. But the readings came back hot. Not burning, not radioactive, just abnormally warm. Consistently warm. Not one section fluctuated. It was like the whole internal structure had stabilized itself against time. The air inside wasn't stale. In fact, it smelled faintly of brewed coffee, warm plastic, and something like ozone. It was an odd combination, domestic and alien. We advanced slowly, checking for pressurization anomalies or any mechanical traps. Nothing triggered. The first bulkhead opened without resistance. It wasn't powered. There were no servos or latches. It just opened as if it wanted to. The corridor beyond was lined with pipes we couldn't identify. No labels, no rust, no signs of use, yet faintly vibrating as if carrying something fluid and alive. The lighting was ambient, coming from somewhere between the seams of the ceiling panels, though we found no bulbs or visible light sources. Everything glowed with a dull blue warmth that didn't create shadows. We moved in complete visibility, yet depth perception flickered when we turned our heads too quickly. Just past the first junction, we found the command cabin. It looked more or less like a modern naval bridge. Console chairs bolted to the floor, control surfaces curved in that familiar utilitarian arch. But again, It was all just slightly off. The chairs were too deep in the seat, the screens too wide in aspect, and there were more inputs than made sense. Knobs, sliders, biometric pads of unidentifiable configuration. On the far wall, we found what made Reyes nearly drop her rifle. A coffee cup. It was resting in a clamp as if recently set down. No dust, no erosion. Still warm. Not hot, but freshly warm. The inside was stained a light brown and smelled like roast blend. Not mold, not residue. We checked for fingerprints. None. We checked for life signs. None. But the cup was fresh. That was the moment when the temperature outside stopped making sense. We were in sub-zero terrain. Even with structural insulation, no abandoned vessel should hold that kind of internal equilibrium. Reyes touched the panel near the helm, expecting dust. It was immaculate. As if someone had just left it. As if they were coming back. Lynn found an instrument panel still lit, pulsing in slow intervals. The screen displayed no data. Just a single line of cyan text that read, "Standby mode, return unknown." The words didn't flicker. They didn't scroll. They were simply there, patient and infinite. I reached toward the throttle quadrant, identical in layout to what I'd used in simulator models years ago. But as my fingers approached, I felt resistance in the air, a slight buzzing on the skin, like I was brushing against static that wasn't being emitted. When I finally gripped the lever, nothing moved. It was locked in place not mechanically, but conceptually, like my presence hadn't been authorized to move it. Lynn whispered something under her breath, pointing toward the corner of the cabin. A wall panel had a photo taped to it. A small one. A faded snapshot of a beach, tropical, with two figures walking away from the camera. The image looked decades old. And yet, the tape holding it in place was pristine. We advanced through 2 more chambers. The galley was bizarrely sterile, like it had been wiped down and reset just before we entered. No residue, no rot. Food trays perfectly stacked, silverware in place. And one more detail. A set of fresh footprints in the thin layer of moisture condensing on the tile floor. Barefoot. Human. Wet. We followed them into the sleeping quarters. 6 cots, unmade. Sheets slightly rumpled as if someone had just risen from a nap. One of the beds still had a mild heat signature, fading as we entered. Reyes whispered, "This isn't abandoned." I didn't respond, because I knew what she meant. This didn't feel like we'd found something. It felt like we'd interrupted something. The final room we entered before stopping to regroup was a compartment just off the engine corridor. It looked like a maintenance bay, but cleaner. Central table, surrounded by tools with no clear purpose, mounted to the walls in careful symmetry. Reyes noticed it first. Each tool was subtly vibrating, but in a different direction. Some horizontally, others vertically, and a few diagonally, creating a barely perceptible harmonic field around the room. When Lynn passed her hand through one of these spaces, the hairs on her arms stood up, and her watch stopped. The time had frozen at 14:23:12. When I checked my own device, it had frozen at the exact same second. We both stared at each other without speaking. Then her voice cracked out the question I hadn't wanted to ask. What the hell is powering this thing? We couldn't find the reactor. No schematics, no guidance. Just halls that kept branching in soft curves, always turning slightly, leading us further into a layout that seemed far too large for what we'd measured from the outside. That inconsistency settled in our minds like rot. This place was bigger than it should be. And the air didn't feel recycled. It felt generated. As if the ship itself was breathing. The technicians were growing uneasy. One of them kept looking behind him every few seconds. Not afraid of us. Afraid of something he couldn't see. Pollard asked if we should fall back and bring in a full containment team. But Lynn refused. "We're already part of it now," she said softly. "If we leave, it follows." I found myself looking again at the coffee cup, still warm, still clamped in place. Something about its presence disturbed me more than anything else, because in the middle of this impossible craft, with materials we couldn't identify, systems we couldn't map, geometry that disobeyed rules of space, someone had stopped, sat down, and made a cup of coffee. Someone very human had been here, recently, and they hadn't left in a hurry. They'd left on purpose. We moved deeper into the vessel with a growing sense that space was being rewritten behind us, that every turn was a gentle erasure of the route we'd used to get here. I tried tracing the corridor with my mental map, matching the angles to what should have been the starboard bulkhead. But by the time we reached the next door, I realized we were already somewhere that couldn't physically exist. Reyes muttered at first. "This room's too big." She wasn't wrong. The doorway opened into what looked like a chamber 3 times the width of the submarine's hull. Lynn stepped in cautiously, holding her tablet in front like a shield. Her LiDAR scanner began pinging data she couldn't process, dimensions that didn't match anything the outside could support. The walls were curved inward, suggesting an ellipse rather than a cylinder, but the curvature reversed the deeper your eyes traced it. The effect was disorienting. You'd look at the ceiling and suddenly feel like you were staring at the floor. What disturbed me more wasn't the scale, it was the sound. There was none. We had grown used to the low hum of the unknown systems that ran through the submarine, the occasional tremor of vibration from machinery we hadn't identified, even the soft distortion of our own breathing inside our suits. But in this room, the air felt sealed, and not just pressurized, hushed. Lynn waved her scanner and froze. "This can't be right," she whispered, then looked back at me. "It says we're outside." We were standing in what felt like a command center or surveillance core. Screens lined the walls, large, seamless displays built into the surface itself, blinking to life one by one as we approached, though none of us touched anything. The first screen flickered and showed the lake outside, but not from a camera feed. The angle was aerial, high and slow like a satellite feed, but the trees were moving at different speeds than they should have been. Reyes leaned in. "That's not a live feed," she said. "It's playing something, but it's not recorded either." I felt it too. The timing was off, like watching a memory trying to correct itself. Another monitor lit up beside it. Same scene, same lake, but now we saw ourselves standing by the submarine's hull, still outside. Except, we hadn't been standing like that. Lynn's jacket was the wrong color. My boots weren't laced the way I wore them that day. It was almost right, but not quite. A mirror, cracked at the edges. Another screen clicked on. This time the lake was frozen over. Thick, white silence. The pine trees stood taller, older. The image was darker, with shadows stretching impossibly long across the snow. Then another. This one showing nothing but an empty field. No lake. No trees. Just scorched dirt and a distant radio tower crumbling into itself. The screens kept activating in a sequence, each showing a variation of the same location, our location, but twisted. Some views had structures built into the mountains, towers we had never seen. One view showed the lake replaced by a massive sinkhole, black and endless. Another showed a settlement, almost Soviet in design, surrounding the edge of the water, with figures standing motionless along the shore. They weren't moving. They weren't blinking. They were waiting. I reached for the console below the monitors and felt heat radiating upward. Not electrical heat, bodily warmth, like someone had just been sitting there, watching. Lynn pointed toward the far end of the room, where the curvature of the walls seemed to fade into a gradient of black. I hadn't noticed it before. There was no clear seam, no transition, just a space that refused to render. We approached, slow, unsure if it was a wall, a void, or a window. As we got closer, it clarified. It was a glass pane set into the hull, but instead of seeing the inside of the submarine, or the terrain around us, the window showed an image I will never forget. The bottom of the lake as seen from below, as though we were staring up from beneath the earth, looking into water from the wrong direction. The trees' roots hung down like stalactites. Fish swam upside down in frozen arcs. And in the distance, something large moved. Something cylindrical, like another submarine, only longer, thinner, and coiling. Reyes stepped back first, saying nothing. Lynn stayed, transfixed. I could see her eyes reflecting shapes I couldn't see. She reached out to touch the glass, and that's when the lights shifted. All the monitors blinked out simultaneously. The room pulsed once, a low-frequency hum that passed through our bones and settled into the back of our skulls. My teeth ached. Then the screen directly in front of us flashed white, and a new scene appeared. A man, seated in this very room. Not a ghost. Not a hallucination. A man in full naval uniform, reading a manual, sipping from a coffee mug identical to the one we'd found earlier. He paused, looked up, then stared directly into the camera that shouldn't have been there. directly at us, and smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, but knowingly. We stumbled back, pulling out of the room in instinctive panic. But when we crossed the doorway, I noticed something else. The corridor we had entered from no longer led to the engine room. It now turned left into a stairwell that spiraled upward, an architectural feature that couldn't exist in the submarine's vertical profile. Lynn muttered, "We didn't come in this way." I knew she was right. But I was already turning, already checking the path behind us, and what I saw chilled me deeper than the lake outside. A second door. Not where it had been before. And behind its window, I saw our own shadows standing motionless. Us, watching ourselves from another version of the room we'd just left. I didn't speak. None of us did. We regrouped in the vestibule, checked our equipment, ran another scan. All internal clocks were now desynchronized. My watch read 16:41. Lynn's said 03:12. Reyes's had stopped completely. Outside, the sunlight still filtered through the pine canopy as if it were noon. But we hadn't seen daylight in what felt like hours. Lynn's final scan before we re-entered the hall showed the impossible. The dimensions of that surveillance room were greater than the entire length of the submarine. It wasn't a glitch. It was repeating, growing, rewriting itself every time we looked away. And I began to wonder if the vessel had ever been designed to move, or if it had always just been a seed, planted into the earth, waiting to grow inward. I didn't want to go back inside, but there are places that don't let you leave just because you've had enough. The stairwell had vanished, replaced by the same narrow corridor we originally came through. Except now, the lights pulsed in slow intervals, and the metal under our boots no longer made the same hollow clang. It sounded thicker, more like ceramic than steel, as if the submarine had begun digesting us. Lynn said nothing, but her knuckles were pale around the grip of the scanner, and Reyes had stopped cracking jokes entirely. We moved in silence, following the flickering lights toward what we hoped would still be the control bay. That's when we heard the clicking. It started soft, like a faulty relay switch, and then built into a rhythm. At first it seemed like mechanical malfunction, but the pattern was too deliberate. Click, pause, click, click, pause, click, click, click. Morse, perhaps, but inconsistent. We turned the corner and saw the source. One of the auxiliary consoles had powered up on its own, the monitor blinking green. No hands had touched it. The keyboard sat untouched beneath a thin layer of condensation, and yet numbers were being typed in at steady intervals. Not random gibberish, sequences. Strings of digits separated by colons, slashes, dashes. I leaned in. Timestamps? Coordinates? None of them made sense. One line read, 1492, 61, 33, 000. Another repeated, 7.9, 13, 21.7.1, 13.5, 18, endlessly, until the screen reset. Lynn began recording. "What base is that?" Reyes asked. Lynn didn't answer. Her lips moved, silently counting. I noticed her eyes had dilated unnaturally wide, as if the ambient light was too dim, but the room was bright as ever. Then she said it, almost to herself. "It's not base 10. It's not base anything. It's recursive." I asked her what that meant. "It's counting and uncounting at the same time," she said. "Like it's collapsing back into itself." The console beeped. The screen cleared. Then something new appeared. A waveform. A scrolling representation of data that looked like a heartbeat or seismic activity, except the peaks and valleys were perfectly symmetrical. That's when Reyes collapsed. She hit the floor hard, body stiff as stone, limbs seizing violently. Lynn dropped beside her, pulling gloves off, checking vitals, shouting her name. I froze. There was a high-pitched tone coming from the console now, barely audible but enough to make my molars ache. I stepped back and the tone faded. I stepped forward and it sharpened again. Lynn shouted, "Mark, don't look at the screen!" I turned away, heart pounding, watching as she grabbed Reyes's shoulders, trying to stabilize her. A full minute passed before Reyes gasped, eyes flying open, pupils shrunk to pinpoints. She blinked up at us, confused. "Where did it go?" she whispered. "Where did he go?" We carried her to the hallway and sat against the bulkhead. Lynn shook her head slowly. Her brainwaves spiked like she'd been in REM sleep for days. Reyes sat upright, trembling. There was a man in the screen. Not on it. In it. He was submerged in numbers, just staring. And then he turned to me. She clutched her chest. He said my name, my childhood name. Nobody knows that. I didn't have answers. None of us did. We waited. When Reyes could walk, we returned to the console. The screen was blank now. But below the monitor, something, had written on the metal casing with what looked like a burnt stylus. It learns who you are before it asks. Lynn backed up. That console wasn't built for input. It was for observation. She examined the casing, now warm to the touch. This thing didn't malfunction. It tested us. I could feel it too. The air had changed. There was a low thrum beneath our feet, like distant turbines. But the engine room was 3 decks down, and we weren't connected to any external power source. Yet the systems here were waking up one by one, as if acknowledging us, accepting us. Or maybe measuring how long it would take before we joined whatever memory this vessel had been keeping alive. I glanced around the chamber. On the walls, patterns had emerged. Faint outlines we hadn't seen before. Like thermal residue or watermarks, numbers etched in repetition. They stretched upward in spirals, looping toward the ceiling, growing denser near the corners. Lynn touched the metal and recoiled. It's not just a surface, it's storing thoughts. She tapped the tablet again, muttering, "There's interference. Like magnetic memory, but organic." Reyes stood shakily and pointed at a second monitor tucked into the alcove near the entrance. It had turned on silently. On screen was a list. 10 names. Ours were the last 3. We hadn't entered anything. "Who are the others?" I asked. Lynn scrolled. "1 is Russian. The rest, no records. No digital footprint. No government log." At the bottom of the screen, a new line began typing itself. Character by character, it formed, "Welcome back, Mark." I felt a chill race up my spine. I hadn't told anyone my full name. Not even the project lead who'd hired me. I turned to Lynn. "Did you enter that?" She shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "But it knows where we came from. It knows more than we do." The room began to dim, not in light, but in presence. As though the walls were withdrawing from us, the metal receding into some other shape. I blinked, and the console flickered again. A final sequence appeared. A single string, burning bright on the black screen. 003H41 A countdown. But to what? Lynn didn't wait to find out. She pulled us both away, leading us back into the corridor, muttering equations under her breath. "We have to leave. This place isn't showing us the future. It's calculating when we stop being ourselves." We made it halfway down the corridor before Reyes stumbled again. She pressed her hands to her temples. "I can still hear him." I turned back, and the console, though distant now, glowed white-hot, the countdown reversing faster than it should. Minutes were becoming seconds. I turned to Lynn. "Did you see a timer on any system in the vessel before today?" She shook her head. "It's new. And it's local, which means it's not measuring an external event." I understood. It was measuring us. I didn't say it aloud, but the thought wouldn't leave me. What if the submarine wasn't built for travel, or for warfare, or even for exploration? What if it was built to remember? And what if memory, for this place, required something to burn? When dawn came, it arrived without warmth. The morning sun filtered through the pines, but something in the air remained untouched by its light, muted, like heat passing through a thick pane of glass. We had exited the submarine before midnight, unsure of what we were running from, but too aware of what we were leaving behind. Lynn hadn't spoken for over an hour. Reyes was shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper, something that still hummed beneath her skin. And me, I was already looking at the treetops, searching for the pattern that my brain refused to admit was there. They curved, not gently, not as a result of wind or snow or age. They twisted in symmetrical spirals, precise and purposeful. Dozens of pine trunks coiling around an unseen axis, leaning toward the submarine like iron filings around a magnet. Trees don't grow like that. Trees don't choose to orbit something. But here, they did. I walked a few feet out from the clearing and spun slowly. The distortion wasn't isolated. Every tree within 100 meters had bowed in the same impossible arc. The deeper into the forest we went, the more the curvature softened, until, about 200 meters out, everything resumed its natural stance, as if we had crossed a boundary and stepped into some kind of pressure field, or gravity well. I didn't say this aloud. I didn't need to. Lynn was kneeling by one of the trees, running a portable scanner over the bark. Her hands moved efficiently, but her eyes were unfocused. "The cellular alignment is wrong," she murmured. "It's like they remember a different geometry." I didn't press her. Reyes wandered toward the lake's edge. The water was still, but not calm. Too still, like it had ceased participating in the weather. A few feet out, just below the surface, the dark outline of the submarine's bow shimmered faintly. It hadn't moved, but I could swear it was closer than yesterday. Or maybe the shoreline had crept back. That's when we noticed the absence. No birdsong, no insects, no wind in the branches. The forest was mute. Not quiet. Mute. As though sound itself had been edited out. I opened my mouth, stomped the ground, snapped a twig. Each sound registered but felt reduced, compacted, as if they'd been recorded and played back through a wall. Reyes turned to me. "Why does the air taste like metal?" I hadn't noticed it until then, but she was right. There was a faint tang, ozone and copper, the smell of old circuits and fresh blood. Lynn stood slowly. "This place is bending," she said. "Not just the forest. Us." We returned to the makeshift command trailer stationed a few hundred meters uphill, just outside the range of the spiraled trees. The rest of the team, those who hadn't entered the submarine, were already on edge. Malik, our project lead, demanded a full report, but as soon as we described the numbers and the hallucinations, he stopped writing. He stared at us for a long moment and then ordered the trailer sealed. Only the three of us were allowed back into the anomaly zone. "You're already contaminated," he said. "Whatever's down there, you've touched it." Outside, the sun reached its peak, but the clearing around the submarine remained dim. Shadows fell at odd angles. Birds flew overhead but never landed. Lynn, Reyes, and I returned to the perimeter, where we placed magnetic markers in a spiral pattern, hoping to map the distortion. That's when the compass needles failed. Not spun. Failed. They lay still, no matter how we turned them. GPS was dead. Phones drained instantly. Even analog devices stopped responding. I glanced toward the tree line and noticed something else. The moss on the trees. Moss grows on the north side. Here, it grew in concentric circles, matching the spiral of the trunks. I picked a sample, but it disintegrated between my fingers, too dry and too oily at once. Reyes stood a few paces behind me, snapping photos with a mechanical film camera. The shutter clicked, once, twice, and then a third time. The sound echoed strangely. She looked at the camera and frowned. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "I just took 3 shots." She opened the camera. "There are 4 exposures." That was when we heard the chime. It came from the submarine, not a siren, not a system alert, but a soft, melodic tone, like wind through crystal, or the ringing of glass struck underwater. I felt it more than I heard it. The pine needles shivered. The ground seemed to pulse once, gently, like a breath. Lynn collapsed to her knees. "It's not a sound," she whispered. "It's a shape." I didn't understand, but I felt it too, like the chime had passed through me, measuring some internal frequency. A moment later, Reyes grabbed my arm. Her eyes were wide with panic. "The trees," she said. "They're watching." It sounded ridiculous. But when I turned, I saw it. Not the trees themselves, but the way they leaned, as if each trunk had shifted slightly. Not enough to fall, not enough to creak or groan, but just enough that their collective posture had changed. They now leaned inward, toward us, toward the submarine, as though drawn once more by that sound. Lynn whispered, "This isn't a place anymore. It's a mechanism." She gestured around us. "The forest, the soil, the vessel, they're components, parts of a machine we can't see." We returned to the edge of the anomaly. Reyes looked back once and flinched. "It's different," she said. "The clearing. It's wider." I didn't want to believe her. But when we checked the footage from the drone, flown overhead just 24 hours earlier, the clearing had expanded by at least 10 meters in diameter. No fallen trees, no debris, just space. As though the earth itself had receded. Lynn suggested the ground was shifting, collapsing inward without sound. I had another theory, that whatever the submarine was, it needed room. That night, we camped at the trailer. None of us slept. Not because of nightmares, those hadn't started yet, but because of the hum. It began after midnight. A low-frequency vibration in the earth, too deep for hearing but impossible to ignore. Like the bass line of a symphony written in tectonic plates, it rose and fell in slow undulations. Our teeth ached. Metal objects rang in sympathy. Water in our bottles rippled. Malik radioed us from the outer perimeter. "Something's wrong with the trees," he said. "They're moving. But there's no wind." We didn't respond. We couldn't. All I could think about was the chime, the spiral, the forest that wasn't bending toward the submarine, but with it, as though both the structure and the earth were participating in some forgotten orbit, a choreography not meant for human eyes. That night, I dreamed of spirals, and something at the center of them. Not a person, not a machine, something older than both, waiting for us to step fully into its pattern. We had crossed the threshold, and it was too late to turn back. We went back inside the submarine not because we wanted to, but because we couldn't stay away. The next morning, the clearing had expanded another 5 meters, now perfectly circular, as if some invisible compass beneath the soil was carving it open bit by bit. No signs of forced displacement, just absence, pure and geometric. Malik had ordered us to collect samples from the ballast tanks, hoping the water would hold clues to how the vessel was resisting corrosion, or how it remained internally heated without power. But all I could think about was the hum, how it had burrowed into my spine the night before, and settled there like a second heartbeat. So when Lynn cracked open the access panel to the ballast chamber, I was the first to step through. The corridor leading to the tanks was narrower than expected, almost claustrophobically so, lined with rustless steel that shimmered faintly under flashlight. No marine growth, no dust. The air was warm and dry, stale yet thick, as if preserved. Lynn followed close behind me, carrying a diagnostic case. Reyes stayed near the hatch, keeping line of sight with the outer hallway. None of us wanted to be alone for long. The entrance to the ballast tank was sealed with an analog valve, heavy and manual. I gripped the wheel and turned slowly. It was smooth, well-oiled. Someone had maintained this recently, or something had. When the door opened, it hissed. Not from pressure, but from within, like a breath escaping the lungs of something very old. I shone my light inside. The chamber was larger than schematics suggested. Everything about this submarine was larger on the inside, like it folded inward against the known geometry of steel and logic. The tank, drained but still wet, smelled faintly of brine and something else. Damp cloth, scorched hair, old electricity. Lynn entered slowly behind me, eyes scanning her tablet. "Pressure is stable, no toxins. But," she paused, "there's a signature here, EM fluctuation, small, repeating." I stepped forward and slipped on something. I caught myself before falling and looked down. The floor was slick, not with oil or water, but a translucent film, like thin mucus, stretching across the metal in irregular patches. I wiped my boot on the side of the hatch and tried to speak, to call out to Lynn, but my voice cracked, dry and hoarse. Then I heard it. My name. Not loud, not whispered, not spoken aloud at all, but inside, from behind my ears, pressing against the back of my thoughts like a finger through soft clay. "Mark." I froze. I didn't move. My flashlight flickered. Lynn was at the far end of the chamber, now stock still, her head cocked slightly. Her lips were moving, but there was no sound. I walked toward her, each footstep sticking faintly to the floor. As I drew closer, I could hear her whispering, but the words were wrong. Not English. Not anything familiar. Syllables that shouldn't fit together. Soft consonants bending into guttural vowels. Her eyes were open, wide, unfocused. The voice came again. Closer this time. "Mark." I spun around, but no one was there. Reyes hadn't followed us in. The door remained open behind us, though the light from the hallway had dimmed. I took Lynn by the shoulder and shook her. She blinked, looked at me, then blinked again. "Why is it wet?" she asked. "Why is the air wet?" She collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. "It's loud in here." Her words were thick, slurred. I tried to radio Malik. Static. The same soft chime echoed somewhere deep in the chamber, and then the voice changed. It wasn't calling my name anymore. It was calling itself. I couldn't describe how I knew. But the voice that had entered me was now repeating something. An identity. A frequency. Not in words, but in shapes of thought. An intelligence that didn't use sound to speak. It was like standing beneath the bell of a cathedral and feeling the air shift in response to meaning alone. I pulled Lynn to her feet. She was trembling. "We need to leave," I said, though I barely heard my own voice. We staggered back toward the hatch, but the hallway behind us seemed longer now, wider. The walls curved subtly inward, not in an architectural way, but as though we were walking inside something's ribcage. That's when Reyes screamed. We burst through the hatch and found her on the floor, curled into herself, rocking. Her eyes were rolled back, her mouth open, whispering in a flat monotone. Russian. Lynn dropped to her side. "She's convulsing," but there was no physical seizure. Just that flat, dead speech. Words streaming out of her as if through a broken radio. I recognized one phrase. Tamir class. Northern Fleet. Kursk. Then another. The chamber breathes below. Then she stopped. Her eyes focused. She looked at us, blinked, and asked, "Where is the captain?" As if we had just interrupted a formal inspection. We didn't answer. We helped her up. She was lucid, but pale, lips blue. Malik met us at the hallway junction. We didn't need to explain. He had heard the voice too. "It's in the comms array now," he said. Not speaking, but resonating. The trailer, located 200 meters up the hill, had picked up a low-frequency band signal coming directly from the submarine, constant and encoded. It wasn't broadcasting. It was responding. Lynn wiped her face and muttered, "I think it's trying to remember itself." We returned to the trailer in silence. Reyes was checked for neural trauma. Nothing. Normal scans. Normal blood work. But she no longer recognized certain words. Elevator was gone. So was photograph. She kept pausing mid-sentence, as if looking for concepts that had been cut from her mind. Meanwhile, Lynn pored over the EM readings and found something buried inside the static, an exact sequence repeating every 6 seconds. Not a voice, not even a language, just a shape. When rendered visually, it resembled a spiral. Later that night, as I lay in my cot, staring at the ceiling, the voice returned. But this time, it didn't say my name. It asked a question. Not in words, but I understood. The question was simple, but impossibly vast. "Do you remember me?" And I didn't know whether to answer yes or no. The next morning, the clearing was wider again. The pine needles that once covered the ground had receded, revealing a barren circle of dirt that felt too clean, too exact, like something had been drawn upward from beneath and peeled the forest floor away. We awoke to silence, not the gentle hush of dawn in the mountains, but a suffocating quiet that pressed against the windows of the research trailer like dense velvet. Malik paced near the radios, trying to re-establish the satellite link that had flickered again in the night. Reyes hadn't spoken since the episode in the ballast chamber. She sat on the lower bunk, hands folded as if in prayer, eyes darting to corners as if expecting someone else to finish her thoughts. Lynn hadn't slept. Her face was drained, her fingers red from running calculations through the night, trying to match the EM signatures to anything. Decay rates, seismic pulses, even whale song. Nothing fit. I was outside, walking the perimeter of the exclusion zone we'd half-heartedly roped off around the submarine, when I saw him. He was barefoot, walking slowly down the slope from the tree line, dressed in a uniform that didn't match anything I recognized. It looked naval, blue-gray, double-breasted, with faded brass buttons and threadbare shoulder epaulets. His hair was thin and wet, not damp with dew, but matted as if he'd just surfaced from water. His eyes, gray like dull steel, were fixed straight ahead. Not at me, but at the submarine. I called out instinctively, not expecting a reply. But he stopped, tilted his head, and then, in perfect English, said, "Is she still warm?" I didn't answer. My mouth had dried instantly. Malik emerged from the trailer, saw us, and froze mid-step. Lynn came out next, phone in hand, already filming. The man stood silently, then turned his gaze to me. "You shouldn't have opened it," he said. His voice wasn't angry, just regretful, like a man mourning something he knew would happen. I asked his name. He gave it without hesitation. Anatoly Vasilyev. I recognized it before he finished. Not from any document or record I'd seen recently, but from a file I'd studied in a completely different context, months earlier. Vasilyev was the second officer aboard the K-129, a Soviet Golf-class submarine lost in 1968. Officially presumed dead. I pulled up the dossier on my tablet. Same name, same rank, same eyes. Malik asked him where he came from. Vasiliev turned, looked up the slope and said, "From the sea." There was no sea for over 800 miles. We took him into the trailer, wrapped a blanket around him, offered tea. He refused food. His skin was cold to the touch but dry. No signs of exposure, no bruising, no disorientation. He asked only for paper and a pen. When Lynn handed him a notebook, he began drawing. Not diagrams or words, but maps. But these weren't maps of our world, not exactly. They were subterranean. Lines that cut under mountain ranges, beneath tectonic plates, weaving into the ocean floor and past it. He drew trenches that didn't exist, or maybe hadn't yet been discovered, and labeled them with a mix of Cyrillic and symbols none of us could identify. The further he went, the more frantically he wrote, until finally he paused, tapped the paper, and whispered, "This is where she entered." Malik asked, "Entered what?" Vasiliev looked up slowly. "The fracture." That word made the temperature in the trailer feel 10 degrees colder. I didn't know why. Maybe because it sounded geological, but he hadn't meant it that way. He meant it like a wound, like a tear. I asked him how he got here. He looked confused. "I never left," he said. "She brought me forward." I asked, "She?" He nodded toward the submarine. We tried to match his fingerprints. The system rejected the scan. His DNA sample returned a partial profile, but flagged with anomalies. Mitochondrial structures that didn't align with any known clade. The analyst on the other end of the line whispered something I'll never forget. "It's like his cells remember different rules." The strangest moment came hours later, as night fell again and the hum returned. Deeper now, like it had settled into the bones of the mountain itself. Vasiliev rose from his cot, walked to the trailer window, and said, "They're listening again." I asked who. He turned to me and smiled faintly. Not who. When. We didn't understand it then. But we would. Later that evening, as we reviewed archived footage of the submarine, taken just after our initial entry, I noticed something we'd missed. In a reflection on the control room monitor, barely visible, was a figure standing behind Lynn. Not any of us. Not Vasiliev. A man in a Soviet naval uniform, standing motionless, expression blank, as if waiting. I paused the frame, zoomed in. His face was turned slightly to the side, but it was unmistakable. It was me, and I was smiling. No one remembered the lower hatch being there. We had been through the submarine dozens of times, mapped every corridor, catalogued every anomaly, but no one had noted the reinforced iron ring embedded in the floor of the lowest level, tucked beneath a loose panel near the aft thruster array. It was Malik who stepped on it first. We heard the hollow clang echo up through the corridor like a slow ripple in a still pond. Beneath the rusted floor grates, partially obscured by grime and corrosion, the outline of the hatch revealed itself. A perfect circle etched into steel, with a locking mechanism unlike anything standard in submarine design. There were no manual bolts, no wheel to turn. Just a series of pressure plates and faintly glowing ridges along the seam, like something designed to open only under very specific conditions, or to remain sealed forever. We gathered around it, breath fogging in the stale air. Malik suggested leaving it alone, but Vasiliev was already kneeling beside it, pressing his palm to the center. The moment he made contact, the entire hull vibrated with a low, sustained resonance. The hatch hissed once, then slowly, impossibly, began to open, downward. We expected dirt, rock, ice. Instead, there was nothing. An open shaft that seemed to descend endlessly. It wasn't lined like the rest of the submarine. The walls weren't made of steel. They were smooth, black, and wet, reflective, but not like glass. It was as if light itself bent away from them, reluctant to touch their surface. Lynn lowered a probe, a standard tethered drone with depth and pressure sensors. The cable spooled downward for 47 seconds before the drone's lights caught on something shifting just out of view. Fluid movement that defied gravity. Then static. The feed died in a blink. No signal. No heat signature. Just one last data packet before loss. A rhythmic pulse, low and mechanical, almost like breathing. We argued over what to do next. Reyes was already halfway back to the trailer, mumbling about dreams of water running upward and clocks ticking sideways. Malik wanted to seal the hatch and call for extraction, but I couldn't stop staring into the dark. I felt something calling, not in words, but in geometry. The walls of the shaft made my thoughts feel narrower. Every breath I took was mirrored by a deeper inhale that didn't belong to me. It was Vasiliev who broke the silence. "She's listening again," he whispered. "You brought her back by opening the skin." That phrase stayed with me. Skin. Not wall. Not door. Like this submarine wasn't a vessel, but a body. And we had cut into it. Against our better judgment, or maybe despite it, we decided to send the secondary drone. Lynn recalibrated its sensors to monitor EM distortions and biological signals. The moment it crossed the threshold, the hatch groaned and shifted. The opening expanded. The shaft widened as if stretching, adapting to accommodate. But no matter how much light we pushed into the descent, the bottom never came. After 1 minute and 12 seconds, the drone encountered resistance. Not from impact, but from something else. Its speed slowed, gears whined, sensors flickered. And then the image froze. For just a moment. A single frame. What it captured didn't make sense. It was a room. Not a cavern, not a tunnel. A room, tiled like a surgical theater, suspended impossibly in the vertical void. In its center was a chair. And seated in that chair, strapped and lifeless, was another Mark J. Everly. Me. Mouth open, eyes pale, dressed exactly as I was. Lynn screamed. Malik pulled the plug. The feed ended. We reviewed the frame again and again. There was no mistaking it. The man in the chair had my face, my scars, even the fresh ink stain on my left sleeve. But his expression wasn't terrified. It was calm, accepting, as if he had been waiting. We sealed the hatch again, but the air didn't feel the same. It had weight now. The scent of salt and ozone hung thick in the corridors. Reyes stopped speaking altogether. She just sat and scratched symbols into her palm with a metal fork, her blood beating without pain. Vasiliev disappeared that night. We found his boots by the lake. Inside them were wet footprints that led not toward the water, but back toward the submarine. And next to them, in the frost, the hatch symbol had reappeared, burned into the soil. We didn't sleep, not because we feared what was below, but because we started seeing glimpses of it. When we closed our eyes, it was Lynn who found it, tucked behind a warped steel cabinet in what remained of the crew galley. A notebook with a worn leather cover, dry and brittle, yet untouched by mildew or rust. The pages were intact, their edges crisp, and despite the overwhelming humidity inside the submarine, the paper was dry as bone. No title, no markings, just a blank front cover that trembled faintly when held, as if the material itself recognized being seen. She placed it on the table, its weight seeming disproportionate to its size, like it was anchoring something far larger beneath the surface. Malik scoffed. "More Cold War garbage," he muttered, already half dismissing it as some relic. But I saw her hesitate before opening the first page, her fingers twitching like the air above the notebook resisted contact. The first 10 pages were blank. Then, without warning, words began to appear. Not slowly, not fading in like ink bleeding through, but instantly, letters snapping into existence as if a typewriter had punched them from the inside. It wrote our names. First mine, Mark Jonathan Everly, then Lynn, then Malik, then Reyes, even though she hadn't entered the room yet. Vasiliev's name was last. Next to each was a line of text, cryptic but unmistakably personal. Next to my name, "Still hearing the sound from the shaft when no one else is." Malik's line read, "Has begun hiding the mirror shards again." Reyes, "Knows the rain shouldn't fall upward but still hopes it will." There were no ink stains, no visible instrument producing the text. Lynn reached to flip the page and gasped. Her own handprint appeared across the paper, smudged as if dipped in ash. But she hadn't touched the ink. She hadn't touched the page at all. We closed it, suddenly afraid of what the next entries would reveal. But the notebook wasn't done. Even sealed, it thumped softly, like a second heartbeat joining our own. And when we turned our backs to it, we could swear it was whispering. That night, the notebook moved. We had left it in the control room, inside a sealed metal case. At 2:41 a.m., the case shattered from within, not violently, but as if something had pushed against the lid slowly and purposefully, until it bent outward. The notebook was resting open on Reyes's cot when we found it. The page displayed a sentence none of us had dared voice aloud, yet all of us had felt. She is under the lake now. She's listening with your ears. Lynn wanted to burn it. Malik argued that it was the only real lead we had, that maybe it could help us understand what the hatch had opened. But I felt the opposite. I felt that the notebook hadn't begun to help us at all. It had begun to catalog. Over the next few hours, it continued writing, sometimes in real time, reacting to our movements. Once, it described Malik reaching for the emergency beacon before he even moved. When he hesitated, the next page turned on its own, displaying, "He will not press it. The pact is not complete." A pact. That word echoed, ugly and ancient, as if something had been promised. Not recently, but long ago, by someone we had replaced. Then came the sketches. Full-page illustrations of each of us, not as we were, but as distorted versions. Thin-limbed, hollow-eyed, our shadows merging with roots, with cables, with the curved hull of the submarine itself. My portrait had an extra set of fingers. Malik's was smiling, but with no teeth. Reyes's image was turned completely backward, her face facing away from the front of her skull. Lynn's had no eyes, and in each sketch the same background, the shaft beneath the hatch, the chair, the other me still strapped in. Reyes tried to destroy it the next morning. She doused the notebook in ethanol and lit it. The flame hissed for 2 seconds, then turned black. Not smoke, just absence. The fire folded inward and vanished. The notebook remained, untouched. But Reyes wasn't. Her eyes began to weep blood. She didn't scream. She just walked in slow, stiff steps into the lake and stood chest-deep for nearly 40 minutes before we pulled her out. When asked what she had been thinking, she simply said, "I was trying to remember the rules she gave us. The ones before we were born." The final entry appeared hours later during the night. We were all asleep, or thought we were. I awoke to a rustling sound. Not paper. Breath. The notebook lay open at my feet. On the page, 2 are hers now. 3 remain. It was counting, measuring, choosing, and I finally understood. This was no journal, no record. It was a mouth, and every time we turned the page, it wasn't reading us. It was tasting. We only noticed it because Reyes was compiling the footage. It had become protocol by then. Record everything, review everything, assume nothing is coincidence. Most of us had stopped watching the recordings. They were unsettling, warped by static and inexplicable compression glitches that never matched our hardware. But Reyes persisted. She needed patterns, order, symmetry. She needed something to measure reality against. On the 4th pass through the drone footage, 3 hours and 27 minutes in, she paused the screen, then called us in. "Who's that?" she asked. But her voice wasn't curious. It was hollow, as if it had finally dropped into the well we'd all been circling. The image was clear, almost too clear. A man stood near the exposed hull of the submarine, head slightly bowed, hands clasped behind his back. He wore no protective gear, no badge, no insignia. He was facing away from the camera. That footage had been shot the first day. Reyes zoomed in. No one remembered seeing him. Lynn swore up and down there were only 5 of us. The logs confirmed it. The rangers at the perimeter gate signed in 5 names. 5 thermal signatures entered the site. But there he was. We combed through every clip. He was always there, silent, passive, peripheral, in the background of a group huddle, standing outside the tent during the equipment briefing. His silhouette reflected in the glass panel behind Vasiliev as he tested the second hatch's seal. Each time he appeared, the air around him seemed slightly out of phase. Pixels slightly too sharp, shadows slightly too dense. And then, in one frame, he wasn't peripheral. He was staring directly into the lens. No smile, no aggression, just an expression of faint recognition, like he was confirming that we'd noticed him. Finally. I felt nausea then, but not the ordinary kind. It wasn't from what I saw. It was from what I didn't remember. The moment the camera showed him placing his hand on Lynn's shoulder. She hadn't reacted in the footage, but the next shot, only moments later, showed her absent. It took us nearly 6 minutes to find her again, dazed and standing inside the submarine's rearmost corridor, where no one had seen her enter. Lynn didn't remember walking there. She didn't remember the touch, but she flinched violently when we showed her the frame. "It's him," she whispered, from the dreams. There was no face in the usual sense. Blurred, smooth, unreadable, but somehow familiar. Familiar in the way you recognize someone from a photograph you've never taken. We extracted the timestamps, cross-referenced the camera data, searched the gear manifests. No trace. He left no footprint. He triggered no motion sensors. His weight never registered on the platforms or stairs. But the images remained, immutable and present, like he'd always been a part of the structure, waiting. Things changed after that. Small things. The logs began to rewrite themselves. Entries appearing that no one authored, field notes describing decisions we hadn't made yet, inventory lists including items we never brought. The cameras would flicker briefly, then show angles from within the lake bed, views from below the submarine, impossible shots from beneath solid rock. And in every frame, if you paused at the right millisecond, his outline remained, growing clearer, sharper, closer. Reyes installed a facial recognition scan using an offline database, out of desperation more than method. The system crashed, then rebooted with a single match. Access level, red observer protocol. No metadata, no file. Just that phrase. Malik lost it then. Smashed his own laptop. Declared the entire project contaminated by whatever force had buried the vessel here. He wanted to leave. But when he tried, he collapsed at the forest line, convulsing, gasping for breath like the air outside had thickened into molasses. We pulled him back. His skin had frost on it, but the temperature outside was nearly 80 degrees. That night, I dreamed of the man for the first time. Not standing, sitting, his back against the inner wall of the submarine's chamber that didn't fit. A notebook in his lap. My notebook. Writing in it with hands that moved too smoothly. No fingers. Just the suggestion of them. He looked up, and I finally saw his face. It was mine, but not entirely. Not as I am, but as I was. Or might be. Or could be, if something else wore me long enough. I didn't sleep after that. None of us did. Reyes began whispering names in her sleep, names of people who'd never been on the team. Lynn's nose bled every time she passed the galley. Malik started drawing symbols he couldn't recall seeing before, but that matched engravings on the second hatch. The man was no longer content with shadows. He'd stepped into our timelines, rewound our decisions, rewritten our memories. And the worst part wasn't that he was among us. It was that he had always been. And we were just catching up. When we reviewed the footage one final time, preparing to report everything to the off-site team, we noticed something else. The earliest video, before anyone had stepped inside the submarine, showed the interior in pristine condition. And at the center, just barely visible through a narrow frame, the man was seated at the console, already watching us approach. Waiting, as if he had known we'd come. As if we'd never had a choice. It started with a drip. Not loud, not persistent. Just an intermittent rhythmic tap against the cold steel of the command deck ceiling. So subtle it could have been condensation or some unnoticed pipe finally succumbing to the temperature differential between the humid interior and the high-altitude frost outside. At first, we didn't react. The submarine, with all its impossibilities, had already stretched the boundaries of what we accepted as explainable. A few droplets of moisture were almost a comfort. Something organic, something we could quantify. But then it didn't stop. The droplets grew more frequent, then thicker, then warmer. And then we saw them forming directly from the ceiling panels, emerging from solid metal, without seams, valves, or ducts. The water wasn't leaking. It was manifesting. One drop at a time, then a stream, then a steady, silent rainfall. We watched in silence as it fell onto the grating beneath the upper corridor, pooling into the gaps, sinking into the submarine's unseen layers. No alarms were triggered, no short circuits, no flooding warnings. The systems ignored it, or perhaps recognized it. Perhaps they remembered it. I touched it, and immediately recoiled. Not from pain, but from sensation. The water was warm, briny, unmistakably marine. And yet we were hundreds of miles from the sea. And the rain came from nowhere. I tasted it before I could stop myself. Salt, and something deeper. Not rot, not decay, depth. Like a pressure so immense it couldn't exist on land. Vasiliev was the first to dream. He said nothing at first, only sat still in the galley for over 20 minutes with his eyes open, unblinking, staring at the condensation crawling down the walls, like it was writing something in a language only he could read. Then he spoke. "They're not cities," he said, his voice distant. "They're organs. The ocean has organs. And they're still beating, under the floor." When we pressed him, he had no memory of saying it. But his drawings said otherwise. Blueprints of submerged monoliths, not carved, but grown. Circular layouts with no entrances. Chambers that didn't serve function, only containment. And time arrows pointing in both directions. Not forward, not backward. Simultaneously. That night the rain came heavier. Not in the physical sense. The droplets remained slow and graceful. But the weight in the air shifted. The gravity felt tilted, as if the floor was no longer the bottom of the vessel but the side of something else entirely. Our watches stopped ticking at different hours. Reyes reported feeling her heartbeat in her left shoulder. Malik coughed up water in his sleep. Lynn began murmuring coordinates, numbers we traced to deep-sea trenches that had never been mapped in full. When we tried to leave the main deck, the doors had warped slightly. Not stuck, just different. Angles were off. Geometry bent in small, nauseating ways. It was as if the submarine was being rewritten from the inside. I walked the length of the crew quarters at 3:18 a.m. That's the last time my watch worked. I counted 12 doors. There were only supposed to be 6, 3 on each side. Now they were mirrored, symmetrical, repeating. I opened the 7th. Inside was another hallway, perfectly dry. Fluorescent lights flickering at intervals that didn't match our power cycle. At the far end was the man. Still, kneeling. Rain falling only on him. And when he turned his head, I saw that his eyes were not eyes, but reflective glass. And behind them was a view not of me, but of the lake. From beneath. As if he was looking out from my perspective, while also looking in. I closed the door. Locked it. Counted the others again. Now there were 10. When I returned to the deck, Reyes had set up buckets to catch the water. She labeled them with initials, hers, mine, Lynn's, Malik's, Vasilyev's. 5 buckets, 5 streams, 5 separate sources, each bucket filled at the same rate. Identical volume per hour. As if something inside the vessel knew us individually, tailored the anomaly to each of us. We tested the water. Salt content differed between samples. So did trace minerals. Isotopic composition. One had traces of cesium-137. Nuclear. Another had rare earth elements found only in meteorite deposits. One was pure. Unnaturally pure. Devoid of anything but H2O. Something that shouldn't exist without intensive filtration. By dawn, the submarine had developed humidity so thick, we could write our names in it on the glass. We tried to ventilate the space, but the fans pushed nothing. The air had gained mass. We weren't breathing oxygen. We were breathing something closer to memory, dense and humid and electric. Malik collapsed near the nav console. His eyes rolled back, lips murmuring phrases in French, Portuguese, and something none of us recognized. Syllables that sounded like sonar pulses. Reyes captured it on a recorder. When played back, it produced static and, underneath it, the faint, unmistakable rhythm of dripping. We sealed off the central chamber and tried to reset the generators. Lynn monitored the battery cores. Vasilyev entered another fugue, sitting in a puddle that hadn't spread, hadn't evaporated, hadn't cooled. He spoke to someone not in the room. When I asked who, he looked at me and said, "You left me down there," then blinked, confused. "Where?" I asked. "Under the cities," he said. "The ones we don't build, the ones that breathe us in." The rain didn't stop. It never escalated. It just was. Not an anomaly. A state. A condition of existence inside the submarine. Something wanted us wet. Soaked. Saturated. So our thoughts would run. So our memories would dilute. So our identities would dissolve and join whatever fluid process was taking place. At one point, I found Reyes with her face inches from the dripping ceiling, letting the water fall into her mouth. "It's not water," she said softly. "It's language. Just not for us." And the walls listened. Not metaphorically. We tested the hull. The sound vibrations weren't rebounding. They were being absorbed. Like the entire vessel was alive now. A sponge for data. A stomach for perception. And the rain? Maybe it wasn't rain. Maybe it was output. Something trying to make sense of us. Decoding us one drop at a time. We hadn't yet understood the full implication of what the rain was doing to us, only that it had changed the rules, changed us. And yet, amid all the unexplainable phenomena inside that impossible vessel, the one thing we should have expected was the signal, the call. Something doesn't arrive unless something beckons it. And Mark knew that. He knew it before he ever saw the pattern. The clues had been growing quieter, not louder. Subtle, misaligned anomalies that only made sense when viewed as the absence of something that should be there. The birds, the insects, the silence in the trees. It was as if the natural order had been hushed in preparation, and we, our team, our expedition, our stubborn insistence on comprehension, had simply arrived to fill that silence with questions. And that was exactly what it wanted. It was Reyes who noticed the static first. On the field communicator, long thought useless, buried in her bag beneath wet maps and half-logged reports. It came as a hum, then a low rhythm, then a high-frequency pulse that cycled irregularly. Until it didn't. Because once we played it through the analysis software Malik had jerry-rigged from the sub's interface, we realized the transmission had structure. Not a voice, not speech, but repetition, precision, and an origin. We triangulated the source using 3 separate instruments, each from a different manufacturer, each previously used for wildlife tracking or seismic scans. And the results were identical. The signal had not originated from the submarine. It had originated from the forest floor, exactly 7 days before we arrived. There had been no earthquakes reported, no construction, no geological shifts. But for a brief, 4-hour window, a frequency burst had emanated from the valley beneath the lake, pulsing in intervals that resembled an archaic form of sonar. Reyes and Lynn compared it to a transponder from Cold War-era naval protocols, something that would be used not to communicate with vessels, but to summon them. A homing beacon, a recall command, and yet the encoding wasn't from any known language or military catalog. It bore resemblance to whale song patterns, but inverted, folded in on themselves like palindromes of pressure. The waveform, when visualized, formed a perfect spiral, and when played aloud at low volume, it caused Reyes's nose to bleed. When played louder, the ceiling of the sub began to vibrate slightly, as if resonating in sympathy. Mark recorded the pattern and layered it against historical sonar data from the early 1970s. That's when we found the match. Not just similar, identical. A Soviet submarine, K-329, lost in the Barents Sea in 1971 under classified circumstances. No wreckage recovered, no distress call. Only one known transmission, logged by a Norwegian trawler before their system failed entirely. The audio from that transmission? The exact pattern we had just heard from beneath our feet. A full match. Mark didn't say anything for a while after that. He just stared at the waveform on the screen, the pulsing spiral repeating with hypnotic precision. He replayed it at half speed, and we heard something we hadn't before. A second layer. A fainter sequence. Like breathing between the pulses. Wet. Rhythmic. Alive. We had assumed the submarine had appeared here through impossible means. Teleportation, government experiment, geological collapse. But now, we had to entertain a darker possibility. That the land wanted it here. That something buried beneath the soil had called it like a dog, whistled it home. And worse still, that the vessel answered not because it was commanded, but because it recognized the voice. The crew was long gone, the structure mangled by time and entropy. But the hull, the material, the internal architecture, was still listening. The signal had arrived like a memory, and the vessel had responded with presence. Reyes theorized that the lakebed wasn't natural, that the entire basin might be a crater, not from impact but from emergence. A place where something once surfaced and then buried itself again. And now it was summoning pieces of itself back. Not metal, not circuits, organisms. She said it with such certainty that no one laughed. No one argued. Because the submarine wasn't rusting. Because the plants weren't growing near it. Because everything inside was soaked in the scent of memory. Because rain wasn't just falling. It was remembering. Mark tried sending a counter-signal, something simple, binary, harmless. A sequence of repeating affirmatives, like a ping. For a moment, there was silence. And then every instrument failed simultaneously. Not powered down, simply forgot how to be machines. Screens blanked, lights dimmed. Reyes screamed. Not because of the darkness, but because she saw something in the reflection of the window. A hand. Not hers. Pressed from the inside, from beneath the glass. And that was the moment we realized the signal was not passive. It was not an echo. It was an invitation. A ritual. Later, Lynn said she heard voices humming the pattern from the forest outside. But when we checked the cameras, the trees weren't swaying. They were tilting slowly toward the submarine, like metal filings drawn to a magnet. Something beneath was waking. The next morning, we found the first symbols scratched into the floor near the hatch. The same hatch that had once faced only dirt. Now the earth beneath had softened, sunk, creating a perfect circle of dark, wet soil under the door. The air tasted like brine and static. Vasilyev, still silent, pointed to the symbols and whispered, "It's listening. It's here. We just made it remember its name." And as the rain fell harder inside the steel, as the signal began looping again on every frequency we could monitor, and as our thoughts began to blur into numbers we couldn't stop repeating, I felt the first pull, not of gravity, but of familiarity. Like I'd been here before. Like I had answered this call once. Long ago. Like the voice inside the pulse knew me. At first, it came in fragments. Not dreams, not hallucinations, but sudden imprints that overlapped my thoughts like oil over water, thin, iridescent, but impossible to look through. I would be speaking to Lynn, asking her to double-check the calibration of the field spectrometer, and in that same instant I'd remember something that I knew hadn't happened. Her voice echoing through a steel corridor, calling out in Russian, panicked, soaked to the bone. I'd see her soaked boots on metal flooring, leaving trails of salt water. I could feel the cold, as though it were mine. Then I'd blink, and she'd be standing in front of me in the forest, dry, her brow furrowed, waiting for a response I hadn't yet finished forming. These were not memories. Not mine, anyway. But they were beginning to settle in the grooves of my mind as if they belonged. They started subtly, like ripples beneath conversation. I remembered a man named Yuri Smolensk, not because he existed, none of our logs listed such a person, but because I knew I had stood next to him in the ballast chamber of the submarine as it listed under the ice shelf. I could recall the way he chewed the inside of his lip when nervous, the way he kept a photograph tucked into the upper left panel of his jumpsuit. A little boy with a red balloon, standing outside a tenement building in Murmansk. There was no reason for me to know this, but I did. I knew that the balloon popped in the photograph, but not when it was taken. I knew the sound it made, how sharp it echoed in the tiny cabin. I tried writing it off as stress, a blending of imagination and environmental trauma. The sort of thing that can happen after days of disrupted sleep cycles, intense electromagnetic exposure, and the omnipresent dread of an impossible artifact, breathing cold metal silence at your back. But that lie only worked for a day, maybe less, because the memories didn't stay passive. They grew. I stopped needing to recall them. They began surfacing unprompted, replacing actual experiences with something more deeply rooted. I would walk into the cabin and know where the electrical panel had once shorted. Twice, back when we crossed the Mariana Trench. Only we had never crossed any trench. Not in this life. But I remembered the explosion, the fire, the screams, the muffled panic through respirator masks. I remembered forcing a door shut with my elbow because my dominant hand had been mangled. And yet, my hands are whole. They bear no scars. I remembered a funeral at sea. I remembered a hymn I never learned, in a language I never studied, but could now hum in perfect cadence. I remembered locking the hatch and turning away from it. The hatch that now stood buried beneath Idaho earth. Lynn noticed before I could confess. She said I had started addressing her as Comrade Petrov. She said my handwriting had changed, that my accent, faint but undeniable, had begun to carry Slavic consonants. Reyes didn't confront me. She just started recording everything I said, labeling the files under my name with a subheading, Pattern Drift. Vasilyev wouldn't meet my eyes. I caught him praying one morning, not with a cross, but with a folded napkin, creased and unfolded rhythmically like a coded message, murmuring the same phrase over and over. He's coming back. He never left. I began to suspect it wasn't just me, that we were all, in some way, opening, that the submarine had not merely been drawn to this place, it had brought with it an imprint, a resonance, a backup copy of all it had ever contained. The hull had memory. The systems had familiarity. But the crew, whatever remained of them, had left echoes not in the steel, but in us, not haunting, infiltrating. The submarine had arrived hollowed out but pregnant with recollection, and now it was rooting itself inside the first available mines, mapping its old patterns onto new flesh. And I was the clearest signal. I started writing in Cyrillic without realizing it. My notes became logs. My logs became orders. My hands moved before I thought. At night I heard the hum of the old engines beneath the mattress of pine needles I slept on. The hum wasn't in the ground. It was in my jaw, a vibration, a resonance, a compulsion. I needed to return. I needed to descend. I missed the pressure. My skin itched for the cold metal walls, for the thrum of the reactor, for the darkness that never blinked. I didn't recognize the longing as alien because, by then, it had already become mine. But Mark J. Everly, the engineer, the man who had been called to investigate a geological disturbance in Idaho, that name began to lose traction in my mind. When I looked in the mirror, the eyes that looked back didn't seem surprised. They recognized me, but not as Mark, as something else, something older, something that had drowned but hadn't died, something that had floated in blackness for decades, waiting for the world above to remember. And now it had found me, not by force, by familiarity. I fit. The others knew. They pretended not to, but I saw the distance in Reyes's stare, the way Lynn flinched when I touched her shoulder, the way Vasiliev stopped speaking altogether. I think they believed they could isolate the infection, document it, understand it. But it wasn't a virus. It wasn't external. It was a mirror, one that showed them what they would become. Because if it could rewrite me, if it could remake the very architecture of my thoughts, then it would do the same to them. Not a question of if, only when. The spiral pattern returned in my sleep. I would trace it in the frost on the windows of our temporary camp. I would sketch it in the soil without realizing. I would taste salt water in my tea. The past was becoming louder than the present, and my own memories faded like paper left in the sun. My mother's face, my first apartment, my dog, all slipping, all dissolving. In their place, I remembered the names of dead men. I remembered passwords to systems that no longer existed. I remembered coordinates. I remembered missions. And one morning, as the mist rose in sheets from the lake and the sound of humming returned to the trees, I looked at the submarine again. Not as an anomaly, not as a mystery, but as home. They sealed the lake the next day. A convoy of unmarked vehicles arrived before sunrise, their engines low, their windows blackened, their insignias non-existent. The trees bowed as if pushed by something more than wind, and the air felt heavier, thicker, charged with the kind of static you feel just before lightning strikes. None of us had been contacted directly. No orders. No official declaration. They didn't come to inform us. They came to replace us. Armed men in environmental suits disembarked with practiced silence. Not one of them spoke to us. Not a glance. Not a gesture. They moved around us like we were part of the scenery, like we were already catalogued, like they knew everything we had touched, said, become. Lynn tried to record the arrival. Her device was dead before she pressed the shutter. Every piece of equipment we had powered down simultaneously, screens fading to black, not with abruptness, but with deliberation. As if the very concept of electricity had decided to retreat. They didn't try to move the submarine. That struck me as strange. They built a structure over it, a dome of steel and mirrored glass erected with alarming speed, like it had always been part of the plan. The pines were cut down in a perfect radius. The soil was replaced. The surrounding ground was covered in gravel, and fences rose overnight. Not barbed, not spiked, just tall, featureless, too smooth for climbing and humming softly, like they weren't meant to keep us out, but to keep it in. No signposts, no warnings, no threats, just presence. Lynn was extracted first. I never saw her leave. One moment she was sitting beside the fire, scribbling something into her notebook, and the next her chair was empty, the paper still fluttering in her wake. Reyes was taken later, after she tried to approach the dome and ask what was happening. They didn't touch her. They just stood there. And she stopped walking, as if her body suddenly remembered the weight of gravity. Vasiliev was the last to vanish. I found a trail of red clay boot prints leading into the trees. They ended in the middle of a clearing. No struggle, no sound, just an absence too perfect to be natural. I was not taken, not immediately. They left me where I was, in the perimeter, surrounded by the scent of pine and ionized air, listening to the hum that had now grown into a slow, rhythmic chant. Not in words, not in syllables, but in breaths, inhales and exhales that matched my own. I was given a room in a facility many miles away, though I suspect the road didn't curve the way it should have. They call it quarantine. I call it containment. The walls are padded, but I'm not insane. The food arrives through a slot, but I'm not a prisoner. There's a camera in the corner, but no one speaks. I'm not alone. I've tried to explain this. Tried to tell them that I hear it. Not the hum anymore. Something closer. Something inside. I close my eyes, and I see the hatch. Not from the outside, but from behind it. I see the grooves of the wheel, the pressure seals, the condensation sliding down like sweat. I feel the heat, the warmth of the air still circulating, still alive. I hear the echo of boots on steel, not mine, but familiar. I smell salt, copper, dust, and old oil, and I remember things I never lived. They've taken samples of my blood. They run tests. They whisper through the intercom when they think I'm asleep. But I'm not. I can't sleep anymore. Not properly. Because when I drift, the submarine comes back to me. Not as memory, not as nightmare, but as state. I don't dream of it. I am it. The hull is my rib cage. The ballast tanks are my lungs. The engines are my heart. And in the cold, pressurized dark of the lake that no longer exists on any map, I wait. There are things I know now. Truths I cannot explain. The shape of time when it's folded. The color of thought before it's spoken. The voice of an ocean that was never ours. And still, the hatch appears. At first it was only in dreams, then in reflections. Now I see it when I close my eyes for more than 10 seconds. Always the same. An old Soviet hatch, slightly ajar, wet around the edges, with air that shouldn't be moving curling outward like breath on a winter morning. Something waits behind it. Not a creature, not a person. A will. A purpose that precedes language. It doesn't speak, but I understand it. It doesn't threaten, but I fear it. Because what we found in Idaho wasn't an object, wasn't a vessel. It was an opening. A doorway carved into our reality by something that doesn't use tools, doesn't send scouts, doesn't invade. It remembers. It copies. It waits. And when we forced the hatch open with our crowbars and our arrogance, we weren't explorers. We were hosts. I hear the humming again now. Not in the distance. Not in the walls. In me. My teeth vibrate with it. My bones throb to its rhythm. It's not pain. It's recognition. I have been marked. I don't know what will happen next. But I know the process has begun. They think they're studying me. They think I'm a casualty, a vector, a man infected with some foreign trauma. But they're wrong. I'm not a carrier. I'm not even a warning. I'm the first layer. And whatever opened that hatch is already inside the second. It's patient. It doesn't need to rush. It remembers how long the sea can wait. So yes, if you're listening to this, whoever you are, if this recording ever leaves this room, if someone decides it's worth cataloging, worth transcribing, I'll tell you what matters. The only truth I have left to offer. We shouldn't have opened it. We shouldn't have forced it. We shouldn't have followed the hum, shouldn't have entered the steel coffin buried in the wrong place, in the wrong time. We thought we were uncovering the past, but the past had been waiting for us to catch up. And now it's not just awake, it's curious, and I think it found something it likes in us.